Welcome back to the Whispering Hour, where the world sleeps, and stories wake. Before tonight's tale begins, don't forget to like the video, comment where you're watching from, and tell us what kind of stories you would love to hear next. And subscribe, so you'll be here when the next story wakes. Now, let's begin. I matched with her on a night when the city felt thinner than usual, the kind of night where streetlights flicker lazily as if they're tired of convincing anyone that the world is stable. I wasn't looking for anything complicated, just conversation, maybe a distraction from the quiet ache that collects in apartments built too tightly against each other. Her profile was simple, 3 photos, all taken in muted light, one of her standing near an overgrown garden fence, one of her sitting at a diner booth with the menu folded like a shield, one where her face wasn't fully visible but her posture told its own history. Her bio read, "I like when people listen. I like when people notice the quiet things." It felt like a message written for someone specific, and I had no business assuming that someone was me, yet I typed hello anyway because sometimes the small courage of saying hello is easier than carrying your silence into another week. She replied almost instantly, not with enthusiasm, but with a kind of measured attention that made it feel like she had already been expecting the message and had given thought to her response. Her name was Lena. She asked simple questions, what I did for work, why I'd chosen to live in a city known for eating its residents alive, what I missed about the place I grew up that I couldn't seem to recreate here. Her questions weren't intrusive, but they were precise, like she had a map of me already sketched lightly and was now shading in the blurred spaces. It didn't feel like flirting. It felt like someone taking inventory of the human condition, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, I let her. We texted for 3 nights straight, the kind of slow, electric texting that makes the hours fold in on each other. She never used emojis, she never sent photos. She typed in full sentences as though she didn't want words to hide behind anything decorative. When she asked if I wanted to meet, the message came at 2:17 a.m., and I stared at it for a ridiculous amount of time, listening to the refrigerator hum and the faraway sound of a train pulling through the city's dark bones. I said yes, because saying no felt like refusing a door I had already stepped halfway through. She picked the place, a small cafe near the river that stayed open later than its business made sense. The lights inside had a soft amber tone like someone had filtered the world through old memory. She wasn't at the table when I walked in, but a coat lay folded neatly over the chair across from mine, as though marking her presence even in absence. I sat down. The waitress asked if I was waiting for someone, and I said yes, though I didn't know if that was entirely true. When Lena arrived, it was quiet, no dramatic entrance, no nervous energy. She sat down, smiled faintly, and said, "I like that you came." Meeting her felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. Not romantic familiarity, not déjà vu, more like stepping into a room you swear you've dreamed about but couldn't place. She had the kind of face that didn't demand attention but collected it anyway, not traditionally beautiful, but built from those soft contours that make a person easy to stare at without meaning to. Her eyes were a muted hazel, and when she listened fully, like each word mattered in a ledger she kept somewhere behind her ribs. We talked for nearly 2 hours, about the city, about how loneliness isn't always cured by company, about how people don't realize how many versions of themselves they abandon to survive adulthood. When she left, she touched my hand briefly, not lingering, not flirtatious, but like someone confirming I was tangible. She said she'd like to see me again. I said yes before the sentence even finished leaving her mouth. The second time we met she suggested a walk. It was late, always late with her, as though her life didn't exist in daylight. We walked near the river, where the lampposts leaned from years of winter storms and the water dragged its tired current under the bridge. She asked me about the house I grew up in. When I described the long hallway that always creaked near the 3rd floorboard, she nodded like she remembered the sound herself. She asked me what scared me most when I was a child. I told her about a night when I woke to someone humming in the kitchen, even though everyone was asleep. She smiled, almost sad, and said, "Children remember the things adults train themselves to ignore." By the time I realized the walk had gone longer than it should have, the city behind us had thinned out, and the riverbanks looked unfamiliar, less like maintained pathways and more like the unedited leftovers of forgotten land. I didn't feel unsafe. That's the strange part. I felt watched, but not by danger, more by a quiet presence that wanted something from me but hadn't decided how to ask yet. When I finally asked her where we were going, she stopped walking. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Do you ever feel like you're being remembered by someone you haven't met yet?" The question made no logical sense, but it landed somewhere in me with eerie accuracy, like she had pressed her finger against an old bruise. When I didn't answer right away, she said, "It's all right, you don't have to understand yet." She walked me back to my building as though nothing unusual had happened. But when she hugged me goodbye, I felt her fingertips press lightly against the back of my neck, as if counting something invisible there. That night, my dreams looped in that looping, disjointed way dreams do when the mind is unsure whether it is resting or being studied. I dreamed of standing in a long tunnel where the walls were lined with open doors, each one leading to a memory I didn't recognize but somehow belonged to. I saw Lena in the dream, sitting on the floor near one of the doors, watching me with an expression that wasn't quite sorrow and wasn't quite hope. When I woke up, the apartment smelled faintly of river water. I told myself it was just my mind piecing together the walk, stitching fragments into a dream collage. But then small, impossible things started happening. A name I hadn't heard in years, someone I knew as a child, echoed in my head for no apparent reason. A song my grandmother used to hum surfaced in the shower even though I'd forgotten the melody years ago. Faces I barely remembered flickered at the edges of my thoughts like someone flipping through an old photo album in the next room. Lena texted the next afternoon, "You felt it, didn't you?" I didn't know what to write back, so I typed the safe thing, "What do you mean?" She replied, "Don't worry, it's not dangerous, it's just something waking up." That evening we met again. She looked different, still Lena, still composed, but with a subtle exhaustion in her shoulders like she'd spent hours trying to negotiate with something only she could see. She asked if she could come up to my apartment. A part of me hesitated, not from fear, but from the sense that once she entered my space, something would shift permanently, but I let her in. She didn't explore, she didn't wander, she sat on the floor near the window, legs folded, hands resting lightly on her knees as if this was her natural way of claiming space. She asked if I had any childhood photos. I brought out a shoebox I hadn't opened in years, and when she sifted through them, her eyes changed, not widening, not softening, but sharpening with recognition that made no sense. She paused at one photograph, me at 8 years old, standing near a park fountain I barely remembered. She traced her finger lightly along the background, not my face, not my clothes, but the blurred outline of a person standing far behind me, a shape I'd never noticed. "He's been with you a long time," she said softly. "You just didn't know how to see him." I asked who she meant. She didn't answer, instead she turned the photograph toward me, and for the first time, the background figure didn't look like an accident of light. It looked like someone standing deliberately still, facing the camera, waiting. I felt something inside me, something old and long unvisited, shift. Lena stood and placed the photo on the table. She said, "This is why I matched with you." Then she lifted her eyes, and for the first time since I met her, she looked afraid. When she looked afraid, it wasn't the dramatic kind of fear people show in movies, it was quieter, almost dignified, like someone realizing they'd finally reached the part of the story they'd hoped would stay hypothetical. She stepped back from the table as though putting distance between herself and the photograph might soften whatever truth she had just handed to me. I picked up the photo, held it under the lamplight, and stared at that blurred figure in the background, too tall to be a child, too thin to be an adult who belonged there, hands at his sides like someone waiting for a turn he had already been promised. The more I stared at it, the more wrong it felt, not because of the figure itself but because I couldn't understand how the photo had existed in my collection without me ever noticing it. Memory rearranges itself quietly, but this felt like something had rearranged around my memory rather than within it. Lena sat down again, this time closer to the window, where the streetlight made a faint column of dust move like slow rain. Her voice was steady again but quieter, the way someone speaks when the conversation has shifted into a space they can't fully control. "Some people carry echoes," she said, "shadows of things that were never given a name. Most people never feel them, and the ones who do learn to ignore them. But you, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, you've been visible to them for a long time. I wanted to laugh, not a dismissive laugh, not a mocking one, just the kind of laugh people use when they're trying to hold on to logic while the floor shifts an inch beneath them. Visible to what? I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead she looked at the door as though expecting someone to knock, and when no one did, she exhaled softly and said, to the things that remember us. The things we leave behind without knowing we left them. It wasn't an explanation, it wasn't even close. But the room had changed, the air had that faint, metallic density it sometimes takes on before a storm, the kind that makes your skin tingle like your body is trying to warn you of weather patterns that have nothing to do with the sky. I asked her again what she meant, and she stood up slowly, walked to my bookshelf, and picked up an old paperback I'd forgotten I owned. She opened it to the inside cover where my name was written in faded ink, the handwriting awkward and slanted from a younger version of myself. He's been with you since before this, she murmured, pressing her thumb lightly over the date. Before you even knew how to sign your name properly. I told her to stop being cryptic, to just tell me what she knew, and she closed the book gently as though the book itself were listening. You don't remember him, she said, but he remembers you. She said it so simply that it took a full minute for the weight of the sentence to settle. She walked back toward the table, her footsteps barely making sound on the floor, and placed her hand on the back of the chair. I matched with you because I saw him. Most people carry memories, you carry someone's unfinished one. I felt the temperature change then, a soft drop, barely noticeable, like the kind that happens when a door opens somewhere far down the hallway. I turned slightly, expecting to see the window open or the AC kick on, but nothing had moved. Lena noticed it too, her eyes flicked toward the hallway that led to my bedroom, and she whispered, he's closer tonight. Because you opened the door. Before I could ask what door she meant, the light in the hallway flickered, just once, the quiet stutter of an old bulb, but the timing was too perfect to feel coincidental. She stepped nearer to me now, close enough that I could feel the tension threaded into her posture. Listen, she said, there are moments in a person's life when something forgotten tries to take shape again, and sometimes it chooses the people who have space for it. You've been carrying space for too long. Something shifted in the apartment then, a soft settling sound, not sinister, not sharp, more like someone lowering themselves onto the edge of a bed in the next room. I held my breath without meaning to, my heart beating in this strange, double echo rhythm that didn't feel entirely like my own. Lena didn't even turn her head. She said, he followed you home from childhood. They do that, sometimes, the lonely ones. My mouth went dry. Who is he? I asked. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering whatever courage she kept tucked behind her careful composure. When she opened them, she said, someone you forgot because forgetting him was the only way to grow up. I didn't move, I didn't speak, I didn't even blink. And then the hallway went quiet again, so quiet it felt unnatural, like the absence of sound wasn't silence but attention. Lena took a slow breath and stepped toward the darkness. I reached out to stop her, but she shook her head. It's all right, she said. He's not here to hurt you, he's here because he's still waiting for the version of you that promised not to leave him behind. When she said that, something inside me cracked, not pain, not fear, but a sudden rush of recognition without context, like hearing a familiar melody without knowing where you first learned it. A memory, not a clear one, not a full one, rose up like a shape beneath water, a small room, a low humming sound, a figure sitting beside a window waiting for me to come back, and I had never come back. The air thickened, the shadows along the hallway wall stretched just slightly, like a person leaning forward to listen. Lena stepped halfway into the dark, her voice barely above a whisper. He's been trying to get your attention for years. Every time you lost something small, a key, a name, a birthday, you weren't forgetting. He was borrowing, trying to build enough of you to call you back. I felt something then, a soft exhale against the back of my neck, colder than breath but warmer than air, the kind of impossible temperature that doesn't exist in any natural space. I turned sharply, but nothing was there, or rather, nothing visible was there. Lena reached for my hand and held it with that same careful pressure she'd used the first night we met. "You can talk to him," she said. "He'll understand, he's been listening to you longer than anyone." The apartment dimmed, not darker, not sinister, just dimmer in the way a room dims when attention shifts from the physical to the unseen. I felt the shape before I saw anything, a soft presence leaning into the space between us, not close enough to touch, but close enough that the air felt altered. I whispered the only thing I could think to say, "I'm here." There was a pause, a long, aching pause, and then the faintest sound, a sound shaped like a person finally allowed to breathe. The shadows eased back, the air warmed by 1 degree. And for a moment that didn't belong to reality, I felt a memory settle into place inside me, not fully, not clearly, but enough to know that whatever had followed me all these years was not a stranger. Lena squeezed my hand. She said quietly, "He's been waiting a long time, but he knows now you're not going to run." And just like that, the apartment felt whole again, still haunted, still watched, but no longer lonely. I matched with her on a Thursday, I remember. Only because the sky had been the color of old dishwater and the day had felt too long in the small, familiar ways that make you look for distractions. Her name on the app was Mara, no last initial, no added emoji, just that clean, unbothered 4-letter certainty, and her first photo was a soft focus snapshot in a laundromat. Fluorescent lights, a line of dryers behind her, her face turned slightly away like the picture had been taken by someone who knew her well enough to catch her mid-laugh. The thing that unsettled me, though I didn't allow myself to admit it yet, was the second picture. It wasn't dramatic or artistic or anything meant to lure a stranger, it was a picture of a sidewalk. But not just any sidewalk. It was the one outside my building, the exact cracked tile I used to step over every morning, the same faint spray paint mark someone had half-heartedly tried to scrub off years ago. It was the kind of specific detail you don't notice unless it belongs to your daily orbit, and I stared at it too long before deciding it had to be coincidence. Cities repeat themselves. Sidewalks look alike. That's what I told myself because the alternative required explanation I wasn't prepared to give. Her first message arrived before I had the chance to send one, a simple, "You always step around the crack instead of over it." I blinked at the screen, read it again, then checked if maybe I'd matched with someone from the building. Maybe a neighbor had seen me leaving in the morning, memorized my small habits without meaning to, and recognized the tile. When I asked her how she knew, she typed back, "Patterns say a lot about a person." At that moment I should have closed the chat, blocked the profile, let the unease settle into the part of my mind that handles danger politely. But loneliness is an expert negotiator. It tells you you're being dramatic. It says curiosity isn't a crime, so I messaged her back. Our conversation flowed with the strange ease that happens only when the other person seems to understand the shapes of your thoughts. She didn't ask the usual things, job, hobbies, favorite movies. She asked how long I'd lived with the feeling of being half a step delayed from the world. She asked if the noise in my apartment ever changed pitch at night. She asked if the dream I kept waking from had stopped bothering me. I hadn't told her about any dream. But she described it back to me, the empty room, the long doorless wall, the faint breathing coming from a place I couldn't see. She typed it as if it were a shared memory, something we'd lived together. I stared at the screen and felt the room tilt a little, like gravity had shifted by degrees, and the only explanation I could find was the one my mind hated: she had information she shouldn't. I asked her how she knew all that. She replied with a photo. It wasn't a disturbing one, not in the usual horror movie sense. It was my hallway, my actual hallway, taken from inside my apartment as though someone had stood just behind the threshold and raised a camera slowly, quietly, respectfully. The shoes by the door were mine. The small umbrella leaning against the wall was mine, the faint scratch on the baseboard from when I'd moved in boxes was unmistakable. There was no shadow, no figure, no intrusion captured in the frame. It was the absence that disturbed me. Someone had been inside without leaving evidence of entry, without the building's old wooden floors announcing them, without the door ever complaining on its hinges. I didn't type for several minutes, and she seemed to sense the silence. "Don't be afraid," she wrote, "I've been careful." careful as if caution were a courtesy she extended to me. I stood up, checked the door even though I knew it was locked, checked the windows even though they'd been sealed shut since last winter, checked the closet even though I'd just cleaned it last week. Everything looked normal in the stubborn way normal can feel like mockery. I went back to the chat and typed, "Why were you in my home?" Her response came slower this time, as if she were choosing each word like a fragile piece of glass. "I wasn't, not in the way you mean." I stared at the sentence, waiting for a second half, but that's all she sent. That night I slept with the lights on, my body curled small on one side of the mattress like I was trying to occupy a polite amount of space. Around 2 in the morning I woke to the feeling of someone looking at me, not touching, not moving, just watching in the way you recognize before your eyes even open. The apartment was still, the air heavy, and the quiet throbbed a little like it had its own breath. My phone buzzed on the table, and I didn't want to read the message but my hand moved toward it anyway because curiosity has its own gravity. The message was short, "You turn onto your left side when you're trying not to dream." I threw the blanket off and sat up fast, heart punching at my ribs. I scanned the room, the corners where the light didn't fully reach, the crack under the bathroom door. Nothing, but the message sat on the screen like a witness statement written before the event even happened. The next day I tried reporting the profile. The app responded with the clinical assurance of automated systems, "User not found." Not blocked, not deleted. Not found. Like she had never been there in the first place. But when I checked my camera roll, I found a new image. Not a notification, not an app message, just silently added to the folder between 2 unrelated photos. It was me, asleep, taken from the foot of my bed. Same blanket, same rumpled sheets, same faint crease on the pillow where my arm had been. The timestamp said 2:03 a.m., the exact moment I had felt watched. My breath went shallow and tight. I checked the closet again, I checked under the bed, I checked the hallway. Nothing, no sign of intrusion, no sign of footprints, no sign of air disturbed, yet the photo existed. I stopped going home before sunset after that. I stayed later at work, lingered in coffee shops that closed slowly, walked with purpose even when I didn't have anywhere to be. But the messages found me anyway. You walk faster when you're pretending not to be frightened. Your reflection looks lonelier after rain. You don't like the way empty rooms sound. I deleted the app entirely, I changed my number, I changed my lock, I even asked a friend to stay over one night, but nothing happened when he was there, no messages, no pictures, no strange feeling under the door. It was almost worse, that polite pause in activity, like whatever was happening observed a kind of etiquette. The moment he left, another photo appeared. This one wasn't intrusive, not at first glance, it was a picture of a streetlight near my building, just the warm bulb glowing through fog. But the second picture, taken seconds later, showed my silhouette under that same light, had turned just slightly to the right, like I was listening to something I didn't know was there. I called the police again. They checked the door, the windows, the fire escape. They asked if someone had a spare key, they asked about exes, landlords, neighbors. I answered all of it, and while they were kind, there was a moment, small, careful, where their faces shifted into the expression people wear when they're trying to decide if the problem is external or internal. I recognized the expression. I'd worn it myself once when listening to a friend describe a nightmare he believed was real. That morning, for the first time in every year I'd lived there, I noticed something outside my apartment window, something I had somehow missed. Across the narrow alley, on the brick wall facing mine, was a faint painted outline of a window, long since bricked over. A window that would have faced directly into my living room decades ago, before the building's renovations, before the walls shifted and the spaces rearranged themselves into modern order. Someone, long before me, had once been able to look straight into my home from there. The paint around the outline was newer than the rest of the wall, much newer, almost fresh, and at the bottom edge of the painted frame, 4 letters were scratched faintly into the brick, Mara. I didn't leave the apartment that morning, not because I was trapped by fear but because stepping outside felt like interrupting something mid-sentence. I sat at the small kitchen table with the chipped enamel edge, watching the faint square of light on the floor shift as the sun crawled up between the buildings, and every so often I glanced toward the window as if expecting the outline across the alley to ripple. It didn't, but the painted shape of that bricked-over window had a gravity to it, a quiet assertion of attention, as if it had been waiting a long time for someone to finally look back. I kept telling myself it was coincidence. The name on the brick could have been anything, the outline could have been decades old, but memory has a way of rearranging truth when something new presses against it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the world around me had been paying a different kind of attention long before I noticed. By noon the apartment felt too still, the kind of stillness that turns ordinary objects into a kind of audience. I moved around deliberately, touching the back of the couch, opening and closing the blinds, adjusting the frame of a picture that never stayed straight. Each action felt like a small declaration that the space belonged to me, but even in the rhythm of those chores I could feel a slight echo, as if the movements had been anticipated. When I picked my phone back up, half expecting another photo, the gallery was unchanged, yet the room felt subtly corrected, like someone had walked through while I wasn't looking and decided everything needed to be aligned by a quiet internal measure. The blanket on the couch, which I could have sworn I'd folded earlier, lay in a long, smooth line without any of the wrinkles I make absent-mindedly. It didn't feel touched so much as resolved, as if the fabric knew where it wanted to rest. Around mid-afternoon, curiosity outweighed the caution in my chest. I stood by the window, tracing the outline on the opposite wall with my eyes, and the longer I looked at it, the more I felt like I was staring into a place with a kind of memory. Cities bury rooms the same way people bury old habits, layer by layer, brick by brick, and sometimes the imprint remains even after the function disappears. I wondered what kind of people had looked out from that window years ago, what they saw, what they waited for. I wondered if Mara's name scratched on the wall was a claim or a reminder, some last whisper of occupancy. And as I stood there, I found myself whispering her name once, not the fearful version that trembles at intrusion, but the softer, questioning kind spoken into an empty room you hope will answer. The apartment responded with nothing but its ordinary hush, though for a moment I thought I heard a faint shift in the old pipes, like a throat clearing. When evening finally slid in, the city outside softened into the half-light that always made me feel both anonymous and seen. I turned on a lamp, just one, leaving the rest of the apartment dim, and the shadows gathered in a familiar, manageable way. I made tea, not because I expected company, but because the small ritual of boiling water and waiting for steam gave my mind something gentle to hold. The cup warmed my palms and I sat on the edge of the couch, not leaning back, just perched there like someone preparing for a conversation they couldn't quite start. I thought about blocking the window, or taking a ladder across the alley to scrub the name off the brick, or calling a friend to stay over. But each idea felt like speaking too loudly in a place built for whispers. The phone buzzed once, an alert, not a message, and when I looked, there was no new photo, no text, nothing that carried her name, just a single notification from the weather app about incoming rain. I almost laughed in relief. But then, when I set the phone down, I noticed the faintest imprint on the far cushion of the couch, a small indentation my weight couldn't have made from where I sat. Not deep, not dramatic, just the subtle dip left by someone who chooses to sit lightly, as if they're used to being careful with space. For a long minute I didn't breathe. The room didn't tense, didn't chill, didn't perform any of the theatrics fear expects, it just existed calmly around that stillness, as if acknowledging an unseen presence that didn't require spectacle. I didn't speak, I didn't move, I just sat there with my hands around the warm cup, the steam blurring the air in front of me, and I waited for the room to tell me what came next. But nothing happened, not a sound, not a shift, not even that faint electric sensation that usually accompanies attention. The apartment felt companioned, not crowded, and in the quiet, I understood something unsettling in its gentleness. Whatever had been watching hadn't come closer, it had always been exactly this close. It wasn't a hunt, it wasn't possession, it was recognition, the quiet, unnerving kind that finds you first and waits for you to catch up. When the rain finally started, the windowpane hummed with the first soft percussion, and the sound filled the apartment with a delicate, rhythmic insistence. I let the tea cool in my hands and leaned back against the couch, allowing the room to settle around me, and for the first time since the messages began, I didn't check the locks or look over my shoulder or brace myself for a new picture. I simply watched the rain and felt the air shift the way a body shifts when it stops pretending not to be seen. Some presences arrive violently, some arrive like warnings, and some, like this one, arrive by knowing you before you ever learn to recognize them. I made the profile because my weeks had been thinning into one stretched, muted thing, and I wanted something, anything, that would make the city feel less like a repeating tape. I wrote a short bio that looked honest in the way people curate honesty online, a joke about bad playlists, a casual line about liking late-night coffee and second-hand bookstores, a photo cropped so my jaw passed as deliberate. The app did its usual quiet work, nudging faces forward, offering me the hollow novelty of possibility, and then a match slid up that made me pause without rational permission. Jonah, a first picture at dusk, a beanie, a laugh half caught on his face, and the background was a dark hallway with curling wallpaper I knew by name. An old Vine pattern my aunt had used back when family dinners smelled like boiled potatoes and reluctant kindness. I thought coincidence, then checked the second picture and felt the room in my chest go small, a mantle with a frame, the exact little chip on the right corner of a coffee table I used to own. My thumb hovered and I told myself to be reasonable, places look similar, patterns repeat, but the app timestamp said just now and I'd been home all evening. I locked the phone, walked the apartment like someone clearing a suspicion, and when I finally looked again the banner had changed to a photo of my own stoop taken from the angle I always took for delivery confirmations. The words on the screen were ordinary, the feeling in my body was not. At first I tried the practical chain of reactions, check locks, check cameras, message him directly and keep my voice flat. Jonah answered in a cadence of someone practiced at small talk, gentle, patient, amused, and explained away every detail with the easy charm of a person who treats the world like a collection of comforting curiosities. I wander, he wrote. I like small places that behave like old friends. He sent a photo of a record store corner and asked if I'd ever been. It was the right kind of innocuous. I wanted to believe him because the alternative required fingerprints and evidence and that sticky slowness of official channels while my life felt exposed. For a week the changes were subtle, new images appeared and then receded, each one a place that might plausibly belong to someone who walked my neighborhood. I told myself I was anxious, that the mind latches onto patterns because it needs something to hold. But comfort is a fragile currency and the app spent it too fast. Then the profile updated in a way that made the polite explanations impossible to breathe. I woke one dull morning, tea barely poured, phone warm in my hand, and there it was, a photograph taken from my own bedroom window looking down into the alley where the old bikes rusted. The picture captured the exact scatter of trash, the dent on the dumpster lid, and the slanted shadow of the railing I know by the nick it left in my palm when I used to climb it as a kid. The image was stamped, updated 2 minutes ago. Alongside it, a simple message. I like how this city sits at night. I read it 3 times, feeling more exposed each time, and then called the building manager without drama, just the thin, urgent voice of someone who needs to know whether strangers are moving through the common spaces. He came down, flashlight cheap and practical, checked the stairwell, and reported back that nothing looked wrong. Sometimes kids walk through, he said, voice low and apologetic, and I took his word because the evidence on my phone didn't give me anything else to hold. After that I stopped sleeping in earnest, the pictures multiplied, and their content was devastatingly ordinary, the chipped edge of my kitchen counter, the particular fray of my favorite sweater draped over the chair, the bottom corner of a library card stuck under a stack of receipts on my desk. They were photographs that knew the comfort of my life and decided to catalog it. I called Jonah and asked him to stop. He replied like someone admitting a childishness. I collect rooms, he said. I photograph small places left unobserved, it's a hobby. His words could have been harmless if not for the way his images arrived with such private precision. He promised to delete them, to apologize, and for a slender week, the feed went quiet and I let myself believe in small mercies, sunlight that no longer looked like surveillance, cups that stayed exactly where I left them, doors that opened only with my key. I walked lighter, letting the day press over me like a neighborly hand smoothing wrinkled linens. It was relief I could afford. Then the account posted a video. Not long, 45 seconds of slow, silent footage filmed from a low angle, moving up the stairwell toward my door and resting on the peephole until the image blurred just enough to be ambiguous. My stomach folded in on itself. I watched the clip frame by frame, watched dust motes move like uncertain thoughts, watched the exact smudge on the stair rail where the older resident leans his hand, and my chest emptied into a dry, scared place where words stopped making sense. I called the police this time, anonymously, at first, then with my details because a person who has videos of your hall wants to be known to the people who call that space theirs. The officer was patient and sounded practiced. He suggested I change locks, gather evidence, and avoid confrontation. The building manager promised to install a new motion light. I did the practical things. The officer filed a report and told me to keep the prints and the video and not to engage. I taped the small glossy photo that had arrived in yesterday's mail, my living room from the angle of the window, and slid it into a folder marked with the date. Doing the sensible actions felt like knitting a coat against cold. It was activity that kept panic at bay. The worst part was that nothing in the photographs suggested malice. They were not vandalistic, not gloating. They were careful and domestic, like someone tenderly opening a book and photographing the spine. Once I woke to find the kettle had been cleared of lime scale and the sugar jar wiped clean, as if a fastidious guest had been tidying in the night. I told myself these might be kind neighbors or a cleaning person with nocturnal hours. But evidence is accumulative and sly. It does not burst forth in dramatic assaults but gathers like mold, subtle, invasive, and patient. The next image in Jonah's feed was of a note I had left for myself on the fridge weeks ago, a shopping list in my hurried, crooked letters. The photo lingered on the taped edge, and in the metadata I could see the timestamp matched an hour I had been at work. I felt as if someone had been paging through the margins of my life, collecting the annotations and returning them to me as if to say, I have seen you. I confronted him once in a public place. There's a small library downtown with wooden tables and soft light that feels safer than cafes. Because its hush is a communal agreement. He looked at me across the table like someone who has been chosen to explain himself. In person he was softer, almost apologetic, and his explanations wore the thin, plausible sheen of honesty. I don't break in, he said. I photograph when buildings are open or when the owners leave windows ajar. I keep them as a record. People forget the significance of rooms. He sounded literate, he sounded like a curator. I wanted, fiercely, to believe him. I wanted his face to be the final answer that would stitch the loose parts of the story back into something sensible. He agreed to delete everything, to stop, and said he would never contact me again. For a blessed fortnight the account lay dormant and my life rearranged itself back into the more peaceful pattern of ordinary worry. What I did not expect was the small, domestic escalations, like a debt paid slowly with interest rather than a single heavy bill. Little things went missing, a pen from my desk, a single sock from a drawer, a photograph I'd left under a book returned with the corner blunted as if someone had smoothed it. Objects rearranged themselves into compositions I would recognize in the air and wonder if I had done it in sleep. Once, I found a small tarnished key on the coffee table with a twine tag, "Remember me," written in a cramped, careful script. I flipped the key over in my fingers, feeling the grooves as if they were braille that might tell me something about another life. It didn't fit any lock in my apartment. The tag was not my handwriting, the key smelled faintly of oil and old pockets. It felt, absurdly, like an offered bargain. Presence, I realized slowly, functions like currency. If you keep watch over something that has had a life, sometimes you become a depositor in its account. The couch, and then the key and then the photograph, made small, polite claims on me. My memory began to betray me in tender ways. The barista's name would evaporate, a line from a song would blur at the edges until I had to sing it aloud to remember it. Things I had once been sure of shifted like sand under a tidal moon. I kept lists on sticky notes, small audits of altered items and shifted facts, and I slept with the lights leaning into the dark like conciliatory gestures. The woman who had given me the couch came by sometimes, each visit thin, a page turned, and she never asked for the key back. "You're doing them a favor," she said once, as if keeping the couch tidy was a community service, and I wanted to ask exactly who they were but the word stuck to the roof of my mouth like a bad aftertaste. The nights continued to carry their small rituals. The humming returned occasionally, always at a time when the city felt most willing to listen, the sort of lullaby someone sings for the purpose of remembering. It was not a lullaby aimed to frighten but one meant to collect attention. When I spoke aloud certain names, old friends, small embarrassments, birthdays I was in danger of forgetting, the house answered with a kind of rustle, as if noting them down. The key seemed to ask for nothing but presence. When I left my apartment to visit a sister for a holiday, I found upon return that the key lay where it had been when I left. It was not theft or menace so much as expectation, that someone, or something, counted on small acts of attention. There are remedial gestures that feel absurdly human, lighting a candle, placing the photograph on the mantel, setting a cup of tea across from an empty chair, and sometimes they work. I kept the couch, I kept the key, I kept the photograph. I kept the lists and the small rituals of attention. Because the alternative felt like letting things settle into ledger entries that charged me for the neglect of not looking. People asked why I didn't get rid of the couch entirely. Why accept the cost, they asked kindly, as if the answer were a transaction. It isn't. Some things in life make a polite demand and our generosity answers back. Maybe it is superstition, maybe it is a bargain. Either way, the night settled differently when the objects were acknowledged. Once, very late, when the city's hum had softened to a faraway thing and the apartment seemed to hold its breath, I sat with the lamp low and spoke aloud the names of people I feared forgetting. I watched the air, the blanket trembled as if in agreement. A small comfort came from the notion that attention matters, that being seen is sometimes the thing that lets a story complete itself. The couch's odd acquisition stopped requiring daily accounting after a while. The lamp stopped flickering so often. The key sat on the mantel like a small relic with its tag turned to face the wall. I moved through my days with an added, careful softness toward objects and memories because I had learned that some remediations are tiny: an hour of company, a cup of tea set across from an empty space, a hand placed on cool marble, and that is enough to make the world satisfy itself for a time. If you ever happen to pass a quiet house and see a chair out on the curb or a small lamp sitting abandoned by the walk, don't assume spectacle or hoax. Sometimes things are offered because someone somewhere needs a watcher. Sometimes objects are like witness statements and require a living witness to set them right. Offer your presence if you can, sit with them an hour, light a candle, listen. In my work of small mercies, I learned that seeing someone, even the memory of someone, often allows them to rest again. The world will still be strange and sometimes unkind. But there is a modest, powerful comfort in paying attention until the bill reads even. There was a night, one of those damp, metallic-feeling nights the city rarely admits to, when I came home and found the apartment carrying a silence that didn't belong to me. Not hostile, not invasive, just waiting. The couch sat in its corner with the blanket folded in that same patient way and the key resting where I'd last left it, but the air felt like it had been holding a long breath on my behalf. I set my bag down and walked through each room slowly, almost ceremonially, letting the soft hum of the refrigerator and the tap drip in the bathroom anchor me back into the world. And then I noticed the smallest change: the photograph I kept tucked behind the lamp, an old picture of my mother taken in a sunlit kitchen, had been placed face up on the coffee table, angled slightly toward the couch as if someone had wanted to share the memory with company. The gesture wasn't frightening, it was impossibly gentle, so gentle it made my throat tighten in a way grief sometimes does when it feels seen without being asked. I sat down, half expecting the cushion beside me to dip with familiar weight, but the fabric stayed still, only warming under my palm after a long moment like a quiet acknowledgement. Outside, a siren dragged itself through the distance and the windowpane shivered faintly. I realized then how much space the apartment had reclaimed, not from me, but from the fear I'd been carrying like a small hidden blade. Fear can rearrange a life faster than any presence can, and maybe these movements, these small tidyings, had been trying, in their strange way, to remind me that attention doesn't always equal danger, sometimes it equals inheritance. I spoke aloud without planning to, the words simple and almost clumsy in the quiet: "You can rest now, I'm here." And for the first time in weeks, nothing moved, nothing hummed, nothing shifted. The room simply settled, the way a long-held exhale finally drifts out of the body, and I felt, not watched, not haunted, but accompanied, in the soft, echoing way old houses hold the memories of footsteps long after the people have left the room. I matched with her on a quiet Tuesday night when the city felt thin around the edges, and the glow of my phone was the only honest light in the room, and the profile didn't strike me as unusual at first, just a woman named Mara, early 30s, a single photograph taken in that soft dusk where everything looks a little more forgiving, her face half turned away as if she'd been caught considering something more interesting than the camera. The bio was short, too short maybe, only 3 lines: night walks, old diners. People who know how to listen. There was no attempt at charm, no curated jokes, no desperate anchors thrown into the void the way dating apps usually demand. And maybe that quietness was why I swiped right, it felt like someone whispering in a room full of people shouting. She matched instantly, which should have felt flattering but instead gave me a small, quick pulse of caution, the kind of caution you get when you open a door that wasn't supposed to be unlocked. Before I had time to think, her first message arrived. "You look like someone who drives without music." It was strange, specific, close to eerie in the way only accurate observations from strangers can be, because she was right. I'd stopped listening to music in the car sometime in September when the world felt too loud even when it was silent. I typed back something light, something deflective, and she answered with a voice note so short and soft it reminded me of someone stepping carefully across an old wooden floor. "I'm nearby," she said. "If you ever want company." No pressure, no emoji, just the offer placed on the table like a folded napkin waiting for someone to claim it. We texted for 2 days, slowly at first, then with a familiarity that didn't make sense given how little either of us said. She never sent more pictures, and I never asked. Her typing style had a kind of deliberateness to it, as though she measured each sentence against something only she could see. When I asked what she did for work, she replied, "I help people put things back where they belong." I assumed she was a therapist or a librarian or someone who worked in archives. She didn't clarify. She asked nothing invasive about my life, only things like, "Do you sleep through the night?" and, "Do you ever feel watched when you're the only one in the room?" Questions that should have set alarms ringing but somehow didn't because she sent them the way someone asks if you prefer tea or coffee, curious, not probing. I answered because answering felt like participating in some small ceremony we'd agreed upon without saying so. The night we met was windless, that odd, quiet air the city sometimes gets when it forgets to be alive for a few hours. She suggested an old diner near the river, one of those chrome-sided places that look as though they're waiting to be photographed by someone nostalgic for a time that never really existed. I arrived early and sat in a booth that smelled faintly of sugar and warm vinyl. The lights were low, buzzing gently, and the only other patrons were a couple arguing in whispers over coffee that had gone cold. When Mara walked in, the room seemed to straighten itself around her. She wore a dark coat, her hair tied loosely, and she moved with a care that wasn't timidity exactly but more like someone making sure the world didn't bruise as she passed. When she saw me, she smiled, not wide, not rehearsed, just enough to say she'd been waiting for this exact moment. In person, her presence carried a strange weightless gravity. She sat across from me, and for the first minute we said nothing, letting the diner hum fill the gap. When the server came by, she ordered tea with a voice so steady it felt like a hand smoothing down creased fabric. I asked the usual first date questions: work, family, how long she'd lived in the city, and she answered each one with simplicity but without really giving anything away. Not evasive, just protected. When she talked, she kept her hands folded loosely on the table, as if keeping them still was a promise she had made to someone once. But the strangest part, and the part one kept replaying later, was how she listened. Most people listen in pieces, interrupting in small breaths, waiting for their turn, nodding even when they haven't absorbed a word. She listened in full. When I spoke, her eyes didn't drift, her face didn't shift, she absorbed the whole shape of what I said, the way someone might memorize the outline of a doorway they planned to walk through in the dark. I told her things I hadn't prepared to tell, a few difficult months, a loss I hadn't named out loud in years, how silence had become easier than reaching out. She didn't offer comfort or platitudes. She only said, "You must be tired." And it was the most accurate thing anyone had said to me all year. When we stepped out of the diner, the street looked different, as though someone had turned down the exposure. The street lamps buzzed in a softer cadence, the air felt like quiet fabric. Mara walked beside me without touching, matching my pace as though she'd done it 100 times. "Do you want to walk?" she asked, though we were already walking. The city was empty in the strange way it gets just before a storm, though the sky was clear. She guided us without announcing it, leading me toward the old neighborhood near the river where the houses were narrow and the trees crooked inward like listeners. The streetlights spaced themselves out wider here, leaving pockets of unlit space that felt like pauses in a conversation. At one of those dark pockets, she stopped. "I don't usually bring people this way," she said quietly, "but you said you don't sleep well. People who don't sleep well see the world differently." I didn't know what to say, so I asked what this neighborhood meant to her. She hesitated, not afraid, just choosing. "Some people leave traces," she said. "Some leave echoes, some leave, wait." She touched the nearest fence with the tip of one finger, like she was taking its temperature. "This place has weight." We continued deeper into the neighborhood until the houses gave way to empty lots, half-finished constructions, sheds whose windows had been boarded so long they'd become part of the architecture. The silence here wasn't absence, it was presence lying low. "Are you cold?" she asked, though the temperature hadn't changed. Her coat brushed my arm lightly as she stepped closer, and for a second I felt something like static, not sharp, just enough to make the air shift. Then she stopped again. "This is the part most people don't like," she said. "They feel, looked through." Before I could ask what she meant, I felt it too, a slight pressure in the air, like someone assessing the space around us, not watching exactly, more like measuring. My breath shortened without my permission. Mara watched me carefully, not with worry but with something like recognition. "Don't move," she said, softly but firmly. "It passes," and it did. The pressure lifted, slow as a held breath being released. She exhaled, almost relieved. "It's always stronger here," she murmured, "places that used to hold people rarely forget how." We walked back to civilization in a quieter rhythm. At the diner's parking lot we stood facing each other, our reflections faint in the chrome siding. She looked at me the way some people look at a photograph they're deciding whether to keep. "You'll message me," she said, not as a request, but like a fact she already knew. I nodded, and she stepped away into the dark, her silhouette dissolving as though the night had been waiting to reclaim her. That night, I slept better than I had in months, though I couldn't explain why. The next morning her message waited for me. "Did you dream?" I hadn't. But I told her yes. And she replied, "Good. It means you heard them." I didn't see her again for 3 days, though her messages came in that careful, threaded way she had, never too many, never too few, almost as though she could hear the rhythm of my breathing through the screen and timed each sentence to slip into the quietest part of it. She asked strange things, whether the corners of my apartment stayed darker than the rest of the room when the lights were on, whether I ever woke with the sense that someone had just stepped out of sight, whether my dreams felt heavier now, as if something were leaning over the edge of them. I answered honestly, because answering dishonestly felt like knocking on a door she'd already opened. And because I had, in fact, begun noticing things, the way the shadows near the closet seemed reluctant to leave in the morning, the way my phone occasionally vibrated as though receiving a notification that never appeared, the way I sometimes heard footsteps on the landing even when no one climbed the stairs. On Thursday she sent a message without context. "Don't let anything follow you home tonight." I typed back, "What does that mean?" She replied, "Just keep walking, don't stop if something calls your name." I stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone face down. That night I left work late, the air thick with the kind of humidity that made streetlights bleed slightly at the edges. The city felt unusually empty, as though whoever kept track of the ordinary population had forgotten to set their attendance for the evening. I walked down the main avenue, passing shuttered storefronts and darkened apartments, and halfway home I heard it, a soft, uncertain whisper behind me. Not quite my name, not quite a word, more like a mouth trying to remember an old shape. I didn't turn, something in the whispering felt thin, unfinished, the way a photograph feels before the image fully develops. I walked faster, whatever it was, it matched my pace for half a block, then faded like breath on cold glass. At my door, my hands shook more than I wanted to admit. The next morning I told Mara, she wrote, "It noticed you, but it's still distant, don't be afraid yet." The word, "yet," sat in my mind like a stone sinking through water. We met again that evening, this time at a spot she chose, a narrow street behind a row of old warehouses where the pavement dipped slightly, holding the quiet like a bowl. She stood beneath a rusted street lamp, its glow thin as paper, and when she saw me she offered that small, almost imperceptible smile that made it feel like we were picking up a conversation we'd been having for months. "You're tired," she said before I could speak, and I didn't argue. She gestured down the street. "Come on, there's something I want you to understand." We walked side by side, our footsteps muffled by the leftover heat of the pavement. At the far end of the block, where a fence sagged under the weight of ivy, she stopped. "You feel it?" she asked. I didn't know what she meant, not until I stood still. There was a pressure in the air again, not heavy, not menacing, but distinctly present, like standing at the threshold of a room you're not entirely sure you've been invited into. "This place," she said softly, "is where it started for me." She didn't explain immediately. She let the quiet stretch out between us until it settled into something that felt almost ceremonial. Then, with the same careful honesty she'd shown since the beginning, she said, "People think dating apps are about chance, but sometimes they're about gravity, about the things in us that call out without permission." She crouched and touched the ground with her fingertips. "Someone died here, not violently, just quietly. The world didn't notice, and sometimes when the world doesn't notice, something in the air steps in to remember." She straightened, brushing her hands against her coat. "Every place that loses a person gains an echo. Most echoes fade, some don't." I asked if she'd known the person. She shook her head, "No. But the echo found me, and once they find you, they don't forget easily." Her eyes flicked to mine, "That's why I recognized you so quickly. You carry the same weight." I didn't want to believe her, didn't want to think of myself as someone followed by echoes, but as she spoke, my chest tightened with the kind of familiarity you feel when someone names a fear you've tried to keep anonymous. She stepped closer, her voice barely more than breath. "Something noticed you the night you walked home. It saw the space around you, it saw what you carry, and it's curious." The street behind us creaked faintly, as though something had shifted its attention in our direction. "Mara didn't turn, don't react," she whispered. "If you react, it gets stronger." We stood like statues, my pulse loud in my ears, until the creaking settled back into the silence. Only then did she release a long, slow breath. "You're okay," she said, "for now." She walked me back to the main road, and before we parted she placed her hand lightly on my sleeve. "Tomorrow," she said, "I want to show you something else." Her touch was warm, grounding. "But promise me you won't walk home alone tonight." I nodded, though the promise felt like a thin rope stretched over deep water. That night I took a rideshare home. But even inside the car, with the driver humming to himself and the radio playing an old pop song, I felt it, that faint awareness, like eyes trying to learn the shape of me. In my apartment the shadows seemed arranged more intentionally than usual, almost conversational in their placement. When I turned off the lights, the darkness didn't settle, it shifted, distributing itself evenly, like breath. I barely slept. The next evening we met at an old pedestrian tunnel beneath the train tracks, the kind of place that smelled permanently of damp concrete and graffiti ink. The lights overhead flickered in uneven patterns. And the tunnel seemed to stretch longer than the geography of the city allowed. Mara waited inside, leaning against the wall with her arms loosely crossed. "This is the place echoes gather," she said. "Not all of them. Just the ones looking for someone who listens." I asked why she had brought me here. She studied my face for a long moment, "Because it's already listening to you," she said. "And you need to know what that means." She led me deeper into the tunnel. Our footsteps sounded wrong, not louder, not quieter, just too close, as if the air carried them back toward us instead of letting them disperse. Halfway through, she stopped. "This is the center," she murmured. "Stand still." I did. The air shifted. It wasn't dramatic, no wind, no sound. Just a change in pressure so subtle it felt like a fingertip touching the back of my neck. Something gathered behind us, not approaching, not emerging, just forming a shape out of attention. Mara didn't look at it. "They're not dangerous," she said quietly. "They're simply what's left behind when people go missing in ways the world doesn't record." A faint, breath-like sound echoed across the concrete. My name, not spoken clearly, not even audible in the normal sense, more like the memory of someone trying to say it. I froze. Mara touched my arm. "Don't let it finish," she whispered. "If it finishes, it binds." My heartbeat cracked against my ribs. The air behind me trembled with the unfinished syllable. Mara's grip tightened, not possessive, but steady. "Look at me," she said, "not at it." I forced myself to meet her eyes. And just like that, the echo broke, the pressure dissolved, the tunnel exhaled. We stood in silence for a long moment while the lights flickered themselves back to normal. Mara lowered her hand. "Now you understand," she said softly, "you're not like most people, you hear too clearly. That's why it found you, and why you need to choose what you do next." We walked out of the tunnel, the city resuming its ordinary proportions as we surfaced. On the sidewalk above, under the safe anonymity of streetlights, she turned to me. "If you want," she said, "I can teach you how to keep it from taking anything from you." Her voice wavered, not with fear, but with something that sounded like reluctance. "But it comes with a cost." I asked what the cost was. She looked away, her expression shadowed. "Echoes don't disappear," she said, "they simply move. If you anchor yourself, it might choose someone else instead. Someone who can't handle it," she paused, "someone softer than you." The weight of that settled over me slowly. I thought of the whisper following me home, I thought of the pressure that learned the shape of my name, I thought of empty streets that paid attention. And I thought of Mara, standing there in her dark coat, listening to the world with the patience of someone who had spent a long time tending to things no one else could see. "What happens if I don't anchor it?" I asked. Her answer was almost a whisper, "Then it stays with you, until it decides what it wants." I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because the apartment felt occupied, not by a presence exactly, but by an attention that lingered near the door, patient, curious, waiting for something to shift. At 3:14 a.m., a message from Mara appeared. "It's close, don't speak to it." I typed, "How do you know?" Her reply came instantly, "Because I'm outside." I got up and walked to the window. She stood on the sidewalk, coat drawn tight, looking up at my building with an expression I couldn't read. I went down to her, the hallway seeming narrower than usual, and when I stepped outside the air felt thick enough to drink. She reached for my hand, not romantically, not protectively, but like someone bracing a door against a storm. "It's inside," she said quietly. "Not fully, but enough." The street behind us creaked in that now familiar way. The air rippled slightly around the threshold of my building. Something waited, without form, without face, without intent beyond curiosity. "Don't speak," Mara said again, "just stay with me." We stood there for what felt like an hour, though later I realized it couldn't have been more than 5 minutes, until the pressure softened and withdrew, peeling itself back like a tide retreating from shore. The night loosened, the air thinned, the world regained its shape. When it was finally gone, she let out a long, exhausted breath. "It chose you," she said. "But not completely, not yet." She looked at me with an honesty that felt heavier than anything the echo had done. "If you want me to help you, I will, but you have to decide now." The choice sat between us like another presence, and though I didn't say it out loud, not then, not in that fragile hour before dawn, I think the echo heard my answer. Before I ever had the chance to speak it. I matched with him on a night I remember for no particular reason other than the way the city felt softer, like a thing sighing after a long day, so I swiped and replied and let the app be the small god of introductions it pretends to be. His name was Eli, short profile, a photo of him in a diner with a coffee cup half tilted, looking like someone who keeps his own hours. We started with the usual pilot exchange, favorite late-night movies, whether we believed in ghosts, an easy joke about the city's most overvalued pizza slice, and the conversation had a steady, unforced rhythm that made the time between my sentences feel less empty. He texted in paragraphs and sent pictures of small, ordinary things, a mug with a chipped rim, a paperback with a cracked spine, and his tone was patient as if he were building a room to sit in with me. After a few nights we moved from the app to a messaging platform that allowed longer threads, the kind where messages pile up like notes left on a fridge, and the chat became a place you touch to feel less solitary. It was warm and human and slow in that way that coaxed me out of my usual guardedness. Then, one afternoon while I was at work, I got an unexpected message from Eli that had nothing to do with small talk. It was a block of text, no preamble, detailing an argument I had had with a friend a year ago, a specific phrasing I'd used about wanting to avoid certain family dinners, something I had said only once and that had felt silly enough to be forgotten. I stared at the message and felt my scalp tighten because memories you assume private suddenly appearing in a stranger's hand rearrange the scale of what you think is possible. I typed back something cautious, "How do you know that?" His reply arrived like a calm paper plane, "You told me." In pieces, in between things, I pay attention. The casualness of that last line was worse than the content. It implied a patience not friendly but persistent, an attention that wanted archives. I tried to laugh it off with a joke, the way you attempt to patch a sudden hole in the wall, but the knot in my chest didn't ease. From then on, the chat behaved less like conversation and more like a slow, building presence. He would message at odd hours with intimate details as if the timeline of his attentions was not bound to daytime or to convenience. Sometimes he'd point out a habit I had, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear when I thought about someone, followed immediately by a photo of me doing exactly that, taken at a time when no one should have been watching. Other times he'd send neutral things, a link to an article I'd bookmarked months ago, a lyric half remembered, a photo of the park bench where I liked to sit and read, but always with the tone of someone placing objects gently on a countertop and giving them back to me with a small bow. The messages were never demanding. They were relentless in a quiet way that felt like water wearing stone, slow, patient, inevitable. I started to notice the way my phone vibrated and flinched, the small electrical anticipations in my palm. My life narrowed to the cadence of his texts. I told myself repeatedly, rationally, angrily, like a mantra, that this was stalking and that stalking has laws and that I could call people and change my number and secure my life with bureaucracy. I did those things, I changed passwords, I blocked and unblocked accounts to see if the messages would stop. I spoke with friends who insisted on practicality, get screenshots, file reports, let the police advise you. I did all of those things because action is a way to keep fear from calcifying into paralysis. Yet every procedural step I took seemed only to make the chat more inventive, more adaptive, as though whatever was sending messages learned the language of compliance and used it to continue. When the police took the first report, their faces were kind. But there was also the faint tilt you see when people try to corral a complaint into what their forms expect. "We'll note it," they said, "keep records." The platitudes felt like polite upholstery over an exposed place in the heart. Eli's messages started to include details about my day the moment they happened. If I mentioned I'd burned a piece of toast that morning, he would send a photo of a charred crumb on a napkin with a caption like, "Burn marks taste like attention." If I complained about the fluorescent light in my office making me squint, he would send a daytime shot of the exact fixture above my desk, cropping the frame so the bulb stain was visible. The accuracy was a cruelty that masqueraded as intimacy. Sometimes the timing was impossible. I'd think of a memory, my father's laugh at a Sunday barbecue, and within the hour there'd be an anecdote in the chat about a similar laugh, as if somewhere a man was listening to the inside of my skull and translating it into text. It is unnerving how quickly privacy collapses when someone decides to watch diligently. Sleep frayed, my phone was an alarm clock and a ledger and a quiet judge. I found myself watching the notification bar like someone watching a slow tide, waiting to see whether a new message would wash something up on the shore. The messages became their own weather pattern, and I began to time my days around them, avoiding leaving the apartment when the chat seemed likely to escalate, not opening the door to the repairman if a subtle string of texts made my chest hold its breath. My friends, bless them, offered rooms for a night, jokes, a clumsy attempt to normalize the fear. Just ghost him, one said, and the simplicity of that suggestion made me ache. If only blocking someone were a single act with a permanent result. I would do it and the messages would pause, only to resume later from a different number or with a photo dropped quietly into my cloud storage. As if the presence had found new keys to slip into my life. What made it sting more than the invasion was the way Eli had folded himself into being my confidant at first. He had been warm enough to matter. We had shared playlists, recipes, small disappointments. When the story started to bend toward the uncanny, I found myself missing the way he had made space in the conversation. It is an odd cruelty when something that once comforted you is the same thing that now destabilizes your hours. I tried to reason with him in messages that became longer and sharper and then apologetic again, trying to parse intent out of words as if meaning were the only place where danger needed to live. Once I typed, "If you care about me at all, stop. If you don't, explain why this is happening." He replied with that soft, unreadable patience, "Caring is a form of attention. Attention has many faces." The line felt like an evasion and a claim all at once. At one point, a message came with audio attached, a file that was nothing but the ambient noise of my kitchen recorded for 30 seconds, the tick of a clock, the hum of the refrigerator, someone's breath, very soft, perhaps a footstep. I played it back in the living room with my phone cradled in my hands like contraband, and the sound filled the room with the undeniable intimacy of proximity. It was not a scream or a threat. It was merely domesticity recorded and returned to me, as if the person sending it wanted to remind me they could be there and not bother me, or maybe to show that they were already there, nearby. The sound did not frighten me in a single dramatic spike, it excavated the steady calm of my life, a slow excavation that emptied things out in soft increments. Eventually I set rules for myself as if rules were armor. No opening messages after midnight, no responding to anything that felt like a detail rather than a question, no cameras left uncovered in rooms where I slept. I bought a cheap digital recorder and left it under the couch one night, thinking of catching the intruder in the act with an evidence trail that a precinct would accept. The recorder picked up nothing but the settling of the building and a faint, distant siren. It had been a relief in a hollow sort of way, proof that I was not surrounded by footsteps and whispers, and yet, when I checked the cloud storage the next morning, there was a file in a folder I did not name, an image of the recorder left on the floor, taken from my hallway, with a caption, "Nice try." Someone laughed in text after that message. I felt silly, caught in a stage trick I hadn't asked to be in. There was one night that changed the scale of my fear into something more elemental. I received a text at 2:12 a.m., the numbers burned into my skull later, a time where the city is usually a slow, kind breathing organism and not a machine of messages. The message was a single line, "I can wait." I didn't reply. I left the phone downstairs and went to stand at the window because movement felt like the healthiest resistance. Movement implies life. From the glass I could see the faint smear on the opposite brick again, a place I had believed had been dormant since the building's renovation, but now the smear held a wet gleam in the streetlight and I realized my reflection was slightly doubled, some small distortion where something had been behind me in the room I thought I was alone in. I whipped around, nothing. The apartment was the same as always, lamp, couch, the small photograph on the mantel that either now seemed braver or more exposed, I couldn't tell. When I turned back to the window, a message had arrived, a photograph taken from the outside, at my level. Showing the exact slit between the curtains where the light leaked through. In the photograph the curtains were parting slightly, as if someone had pinched the fabric and let it open the tiniest amount to look in. I called a friend at 3 in the morning and asked him to stay on the phone with me, a ridiculous comfort for a ridiculous fear. We spoke in low voices about trivia until the sun made the city lazy and reasonable again, and when the light came the messages paused, as if the presence had chosen to rest with the day. I told the police all of it, every message, every image, every audio file. They took notes and suggested further practical steps. They suggested changing locks, installing cameras, moving temporarily if it escalated. They warned about legal definitions and privacy law, and their faces, while sympathetic, still had that tiny professional distance that reads like a soft apology. We can do only so much unless we catch someone in the act. I bought a camera and installed it over my doorway. Its red dot a tiny watchful eye, and for 2 nights the feed sat quiet and clinical. Then, one morning, I checked the footage and found the camera had not been moved, but its timestamp flickered and then showed a gap of 3 minutes during which the image was simply bare, nothing to record. The file was blank in the middle. The recorder had recorded my apartment music and the sound of the city, and then a minute of silence that was not silence but the absence of capture, as if whatever moved through the apartment existed on a frequency my devices could not register. By the time the chat began to sound like a ritual rather than a conversation, I was not surprised by anything the messages contained. Names, small accounts of my preferences, poems about the way light sits on a windowsill at dawn, each a needle slipped into a map of my life. And yet one night a line arrived that unsettled me more sharply than any photograph had. Do you ever imagine what it would be like to be entirely known? It arrived as we were trading playlists, and the question felt like a stake driven softly into the middle of the road. I typed back with trembling polish, not entirely. That feels dangerous. He replied almost immediately, dangerous can be a kind of intimacy. I balked at the logic. The exchange had the soft skill of someone who tried arguments like spices and tested which one fit my mouth. I thought finally to stop it by doing what people do when the law is slow and the presence is patient. I changed my routine. I took the long route to work, I used different cafes, I varied my patterns until the city felt like a set of options rather than a map of my habits. For a while it worked. The messages retreated into a polite distance, the way an animal retreats when you make yourself larger. I relaxed, I laughed with friends, I slept with both doors locked and the camera on. Then, on a Wednesday with rain that rubbed the city's edges soft, a message came that was not a photo and not a file but a short sentence that felt like a hand placed flat across my chest. I'm tired of quiet, tell me what you fear. The bluntness of the demand made me honest in a way the chat never had. I answered, because sometimes telling the truth is one way to make a thing stop asking. I typed, I fear being alone with someone who knows me more than I know myself. He responded with a single word I did not expect. Stay. It was the only invitation he'd made that sounded like a choice rather than a compulsion, and I understood then that the chat had become less of a digital exchange and more of a place where boundaries were being drawn and erased at the same time. I felt foolish typing that one syllable of agreement, but loneliness is a persistent argument with better rhetoric than logic. I wrote back, for how long? The reply was immediate and practical, until you say otherwise. I told myself I would keep the arrangement public and small, that I would invite people over, that I would do anything to make the presence accountable. For a few days the messages were like a low, companionable noise. He wrote me lines about the way rain smells in the city and sent photos of puddles that looked like small mirrors. He sent recipes and asked for my opinions on wines I'd never tasted. He praised the writing notes I left in my phone. He was, in many ways, the kind of attentive person you think you deserve. But attention, over time, is a thing that wears clothes, sometimes useful clothes, sometimes garments of expectation. One evening, when I had a friend over and we toasted to banal successes, Eli sent a short line, "You look better when you laugh." It was not a compliment so much as a curated observation, and the intimacy of it tightened something in my chest. When my guest left that night, the apartment felt quieter and lonelier than before, the presence of the chat a warmth that was both cradle and pressure. There is a moment in these stories when you realize the device that makes life kinder also turns into an appliance for your surveillance. Mine came late as the city slept, when the chat sent a photo of the back of my head as I walked to the kitchen for water, an innocuous angle that revealed a familiar tear in my sweater. The timestamp read the exact second I'd risen from the couch, and for the first time I felt the full weight of how a person could become data to be annotated and archived. I stood in my kitchen with a glass of water sweating in my palm and the phone screen blue with his name, and I understood with a cold clarity that this was no longer about companionship. It had become a ledger of sight. The solution is never simple. I wrote him a message at 2 in the morning, fingers moving fast and clumsy. This ends now. Delete my photos, stop contacting me. I hit send. I slept with the phone turned off and under my pillow, because sometimes dark silence is the only buffer you can find between yourself and a world gone too solicitous. In the morning the messages were gone. For 36 blessed hours, there was nothing but the city's usual indifferent noise and the modest, mortal rhythms of my apartment. I let myself pretend that the danger had passed. I walked outside without checking the corners of the street, and the world felt possible in its ordinary, grinding way. Then, late on the second night, a single notification vibrated on my desk. A new message. I opened it with a hand that no longer trusted its own courage. The message was a photograph of the little paper folder where I had kept my evidence, the prints, the photo, the timestamps, opened flat on my table. A small, careful note lay on top of the folder in handwriting that, horrifyingly, matched my own, "We keep what you give." Below the note, in the chat bubble, a line read, "We never forget the faces that let us in." When you have been seen and catalogued, reclaiming the privacy you once had is less about force and more about removing yourself from the ledger. I moved after that week, small, practical steps, new place, new locks, different light fixtures. The message threads remained in my phone like fossilized maps, and sometimes when the city grew quiet enough at night I would scroll back to see if the conversation had left any residues I'd missed. I never saw him again. The account disappeared in the way things do in feeds, muted, deleted, like a page torn out of an old book. But sometimes at 2 in the morning my phone would buzz with a gentle, anonymous alert, a weather update, a calendar reminder, and for a split second the muscle memory of waiting would tighten my palms. The chat had taught me how quickly attention could turn from kindness into ownership. It taught me the particular cruelty of being known without choosing to be known, and the small, fierce grace of learning to live otherwise. If you ever find your phone lighting up with details that belong only to you, treat the illumination like a signal flare, respond with the practicalities, screenshots, police reports, friends who sit with you through the small hours, but also do the quiet work of retreat. Reclaim the rooms you can. Photograph them yourself, post the images loudly and publicly so that the thrill of a secret is gone. Sometimes visibility is armor, sometimes it's also a way to insist that the things you own are yours to show. You have been listening to The Whispering Hour. Tonight's tale fades softly, leaving its last light in the quiet corners of your mind. Let the echoes settle. Let the darkness rest. Good night.